Okay, welcome to the session on featuring Sonoma State undergraduate papers, and we are grateful to the CSA for allowing us to have this session to feature our students' work. And we have 3 presenters today. Good, we have an audience.
Observe.
Okay, we have 3 presenters today. Kevin Brown will be talking about restorative justice volunteers. Jennifer Duenas will be talking about navigating and framing the education and identity of autism spectrum disorder children within the structure of public schools. And she will focus on parents as caretakers, interpreters, and advocates. And third, Katie Gordon will be talking about the body in transition, student veterans in the academic sphere. And each of their presentations is based on original research that they've done in the past year. And we're going to go in order of the program. So we're going to start with Kevin.
Thank you for coming to my presentation today. My site selection was Restorative Resources in Santa Rosa, representing Sonoma County. Restorative justice is an alternative to the traditional processing of offenders in the criminal justice system. This allows them to not be labeled as criminals and effectively get their record clean. The main focus here is on juveniles. They do also take in adults in their 30s at times. Our research interest is on the volunteers helping the program succeed. There's 3 aspects that are very important. First of all is the victims and their needs need to be met with this program. Second is the offenders. They need to be accountable for their actions, and they need to right the wrong as much as they can possibly do. And the community is very important. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. The volunteers, they're able to facilitate the conversation. They're able to represent the victim if the victim doesn't feel like they want to show up for whatever reason. And also, sometimes the community is a victim, especially when it's graffiti, vandalism. Affects the entire community. I looked at a lot of prior research from places like Vermont, Canada, Europe, Florida, and others, and I found many of the common themes as I did in Sonoma County, such as they were mainly older, middle class, higher class in the clientele, mostly Caucasian. This was different than the youths in the system. The youth were more minorities of lower class, less educated. There are very few conservatives representing. Mostly they're more moderate or liberal in their political views. I thought Santa Rosa may be a little different. I did find that a lot of the clientele were Latinos, but very few of the volunteers were Latinos. Restorative Resources wanted feedback on how the program was working, how the volunteers perceived it working. So me and the coordinator worked together to find some effective questions to ask to get really important data. The methods I used to find this qualitative data was I interviewed 10 people. They lasted 10 to 20 minutes with open-ended questions. I started in September 2014 and it lasted until mid-October. The questions I asked were, how did you get involved volunteering at Restorative Resources? What other volunteering have you done? How often and how long have you volunteered? How were you selected? What type of training did you get here? Do you think that training readied you for what you experienced here? How do you feel like restorative justice is helping the community? How do you think the victims are being treated during the process? What kind of impact does this have on the offender? Would you prefer this type of justice if you were a victim? What are your goals for our restorative justice? And what do you think should or could be changed in our current justice system? And my last question was, how does your family, friends, and people you know think about your volunteering here? After this, I transcribed everything I interviewed. All of these pages of data I read, and I found common themes, and I coded these themes. After that, I wanted a hands-on experience, so I observed a conference. As you can see in the picture, this is a circle. There's a victim there, there's a community there, and there's the offender. The offender here has to say he's responsible for what happened, for the wrong he committed. The victim has a really strong say in what happens here. I observed this. I observed a theft. And it was really touching to hear different perspectives on why this happened and how we could make this not happen again in our community. The questions I got answered here first was, why do people initially volunteer in restorative justice programs? There were many different answers for this, but common things were giving back to society, helping change the offender, and helping just to give a good lead for the future of the next generation. A quote I got from a very good interviewer was, well, I was also part of a group called Latino Leaders, and somebody came and talked to us and told us that there were 60% of the kids in trouble that were coming in the program were Latino, but there were less than 5% Latino counselors or circle people. So I wanted to check for myself and see what it was all about, and I fell in love with it. It was amazing. This man was a Latino man, and he, this was his motivation, and he tried to get his friends and family to be also involved in the system. Another question I got answered was, after they got in, why did they continue volunteering? This person said, because there is a sense of making a difference. You made a part in a team that made a difference in the victim and the offender, and that's why people hang around. So these people really believe they're making a difference in society, helping people to stop the revolving door of going back and forth inside the criminal justice system. Continuing, why do people volunteer here? So the volunteer perspectives, like I said earlier, giving back. There's also gender differences I found. Many of the females here, they, in their life and their work, they nurture people. So like after school programs, they were involved in a lot more. They were involved in volunteering at jails, food banks. The men more had traditional careers, such as lawyers, businessmen, and law enforcement I interviewed. They wanted to help give the juveniles, the young people, a second chance. Many of them admitted to making mistakes when they were young, and they believe they got a second chance and want the people involved in this program to as well. What do volunteers get from this? I had a really important quote. I feel personally really privileged to be able to be asked to join the circle and to be part of this. I feel truly privileged. I feel like I've been given so much by this. So the volunteers give, but they truly believe they are given more than they give out. The common themes I mentioned earlier, accountability. This was mentioned 26 times throughout my interviews. The volunteers thought it was very important for the offenders to be accountable and responsible for their actions and own what they have done. A quote that represents this is a volunteer talking about one of the young people going through the program. I did this, and I know I want to make it better, and so I think people have a chance to regain the trust they had with this person. So that's, having the offender right is wrong, and hopefully be trusted again by the community. The community is the next theme I want to talk about. The community came up throughout every single interview 39 times, and people had a really strong sense of community and what it meant. Even though these volunteers were mostly white, they believed the Latino community was part of their own community. The quote I had here is talking about the police chief, talking about his meeting with the police chief. He had another idea and wanted us to come every time there's a problem with the police in the community. So the police chief here was very happy this program was implemented, and he wanted to be a part of it. If you don't know, in Santa Rosa there was a killing of a young boy, so the community relations has been, hurt by that. So you can see here that people are really trying to make a difference now. The next common theme was creating change. So this is creating change in society, the offender, and the victim. Another quote I have here, and just to let you know, creating change was mentioned 40 times, the most out of all the themes I found. So the quote is, this person is really getting it. They appreciate the chance and the change that is truly amazing, this change we need in our society. So the volunteers, they perceive that they do come from a different culture and class at times than the clientele. There's ethnic differences. Like I said, the volunteers are very few percent Latino, but the clientele is very high. They get ethnic training, ethnic diversity training. They're very aware of the cultural differences, and this training allows them to manage it properly. They also perceive a big injustice going on in the criminal justice system that really hurts the minorities, and they want to help change the system and make it better for the community and the offender and even the victim. This is what I found from my research so far, and I appreciate everyone coming in and listening to my project.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions about my project?
Yes. Should we have questions now or wait till the end?
If we want to do them now, I have questions.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah,
Sounds
I
good.
do it that way. I'm kind of interested in what your plans are for the future of this kind of a project. Are you going to go back and do more of this, or
Yes, I want to get more statistics on like demographics. I haven't got, so I'm going to send out a questionnaire to the volunteers there, and hopefully get feedback from the coordinator there and see if anything else needs to be answered. And I want them to know how they could get more volunteers so they can see their motivations and how they can make more of a community represented there. So that's
okay?
what I like.
So you have kind of an applied interest in helping the organization grow.
Yeah, definitely. I
Okay,
think it's a good
good.
organization myself, so
Right.
I'd like to help them as much as I can.
Right? And have you thought about other organizations as well, or are you? Is it this organization that you're interested in, or volunteering in general, or what's driving you with this project?
Yeah, I'm kind of new to the whole, volunteering aspect of criminal justice, but I think it's good for everything. Volunteering in jails is very important. Much of the literature I read was volunteering in general, so volunteering in jails and high schools I think is all very important.
Yeah, there's last year at this meeting I saw a presentation from some undergraduates who had gotten involved in a prison education program through Vanguard University, and it was really neat. And they were doing volunteer work. They were going into the prisons, and there was a professor who was actually teaching, but they were like TAs basically and helping out. And it was a really neat project. So I think there's a lot of, even within criminal justice, right, a lot of places to look for, good volunteering types of places to do studies. So I think that's really neat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question. So generally, what types of crimes are they committing? Are they,
Oh yeah,
what kind of low
should have
offender?
addressed that.
or
Like
phrases?
the one I attended and observed, it was a theft
Mhm.
from a department store.
Mhm.
So low-level crimes,
Mhm.
not violent crimes usually. So a lot of theft and vandalism.
Mhm. And so the victim gets a lot out of it, gets as much out of the meeting in the circle as much as the offender does, it sounds like. That there's kind of a mutual.
Yeah, the victim gets to express their feelings. Unlike the criminal justice system, they're able to tell the offender what to do to make it right. If it's to pay back a certain amount of money, to go through programs. The one I witnessed, the store, they wrote an entire letter saying how much theft every year is caused by this, so the prices go up, so that hurts the entire community. And it's just like, it's shocking to the employees to see someone, stealing from them and what they have to deal with. So,
And I don't remember if you covered this or not, does the recidivism rate go down with these, or do they generally kind of stop them from becoming repeat offenders?
studies have shown that it is a successful program, and the volunteers are much more happy with the results than the criminal justice system. So,
It sounds effective.
Kevin, when you went to the conference. How were you introduced there? Were you like off on the side as an observer?
Oh yes, I was.
Were you a part of it?
I had no communication with anyone. I was just to the side of the observer, representing the community. So I had no say in anything going on. Just listen.
Okay, so did you sit with other volunteers?
There was one other observer that was sitting outside the circle as well,
Yeah.
but the rest of the community was talking and being part of the discussion.
Did you have to introduce yourself to the group?
Oh, I did not.
Oh, okay. So you were truly an observer. They allowed you to do that.
It's very nice. Yeah, that anybody in the community come and observe, so they can be educated on what happens. And
Yeah.
it's a public event, I believe. So
Yeah, anyone from the community can come to these things. Is that correct?
yes.
Yeah, very cool.
I have another, I don't know, not really so much of a question, but the methodology here, one of the things that, if you haven't used it, I wanted to suggest for transcribing, if you think about speech recognition software, like Dragon Naturally Speaking, what I always use when I transcribe, do a lot of interviews and a lot of transcribing, and it's horrible work. So did you, how do you think?
Yeah, it's my first true transcription I did like this. I did do everything by hand, but
Yeah. Think about next time, think about because basically just do the recording and then put in an earbud headphone, listen to the recording, and then speak the entire recording back to my computer and it types it all back up. And, you know, it'll cut
You
your
have
time.
to train Dragon.
You do have to train Dragon.
Right.
Dragon training now is down to less than 10 minutes now. Yeah,
Wow.
it used to be over an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't over an hour, not that long ago.
And it used to be expensive, I hear it's free now.
You can get, well, you can actually get on your phone. They have an app, right? So if you have, I think
A Dragon app.
right, there's a Dragon app that you can just talk to your phone and it will transcribe what you're saying.
Yeah.
But the regular version is like $100, I think, for the new one. And if you get the older versions, like last year's version, you can do it for like $20 or something.
Wow.
Okay.
So it's a great tool. And then the other thing for analysis that there's a lot of choices out there, but I really like the program in Vivo for coding. And you know, it's kind of expensive. It's like a $600 program. So you kind of most people need to have it like at the computer lab on campus or something like that. But and then there's Atlas TI is the other big one. You know, if you're doing interviews. So you know, as you move forward, right, and play more with qualitative interviewing, you want to kind of get more in tune to some of that software that can help you do everything, all that coding and all the transcribing easier.
Taking a lot of time.
Yeah, it saved a lot of time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So would you, I'm thinking about buying Atlas TI, because I probably wouldn't be able to afford the $600 program, but I took a workshop in it, but it was very brief. Would you recommend it for?
I think they're both great. I use in Vivo myself because that's what I was trained on when I was starting, but I've used Atlas TI before, and I think they're both very similar to each other.
Okay.
Either one is fine, I think. And a lot of sociologists use Atlas TI, a lot of anthropologists, and a lot of other people use it. So it's a good program. They're both great for doing analysis.
Thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, excellent questions.
I'm sorry I have to leave. I would love to stay for your entire session. You know that.
Yeah.
You can watch the recording later.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next presentation is by Jennifer Duenas, and it is on parents of children with autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, my name is Jennifer Duenas, and I'm an undergraduate student at Sonoma State University. I'm also an educational advocate and a parent to 2 autistic children. So naturally, that's sort of where my interest in this topic came from. So basically, I'm using in-depth interviews with parents from different social class backgrounds. I'm describing the different ways that parents advocate for their autism spectrum child's education and within the structure of the public school system. The purpose of the research was to sort of discover how the experience of the ASD diagnosis for the parent and the child was shaped by particular institutional arrangements, in this case the institution being the public school system, and how those different arrangements and requirements, and as well as the cultural capital and economic resources of the parents affect the role of advocate. So just moving forward, just some terms in case some of you are not familiar with this world. When I say ASD, I'm referring to an autism spectrum disorder. And it is a spectrum, so you can have what's called high-functioning children, and it goes all the way up to low-functioning. An IEP stands for an individual education plan, which is something that's in place for a disabled child within the public school system, and that affords them certain rights and services and things like that. So you can't really advocate a whole lot unless you have an IEP in place for a child with disabilities. In addition, when I refer to general education, I'm referring to a specific type of classroom that you'll see. It's the most common type. It's a non-special education classroom, and it consists mostly of what we call neurotypical students, so just your regular average child is in a general education classroom. Talking about the significance of this study, or why, it's $1 million question, why, who cares? There's ongoing debates, really honestly, about whether or not we've seen an increase in the prevalence of ASD children. And even though there are these debates, the CDC did report that there was a 78% increase in the prevalence just between 2006 and 2008. And this is after they controlled for shifts in diagnostics and assessments, because that was one of the big things that they were having to answer towards as well. Has there really been an increase in prevalence, or are we just now being more educated, and have these kids always existed? We just have a better tool to diagnose and assess these kiddos. In addition, the general education service placement of students with ASD has increased at a faster rate than all other disability categories combined. So basically what this means is that in a general education classroom, if there is a disabled child mainstreamed, there's a good chance that they're going to have an ASD versus some other sort of disability. And there's also a correlation between education and poverty. So I think that addressing the educational needs and deficits, if any, at this stage for these children are very important. And also there's an increasing financial hardship for families who do have an ASD child, as well as the healthcare industry. So those are some of the points, significance that I discovered. Moving forward, I just kind of wanted to just briefly talk about current legislation. These are the pieces that are in place currently that afford children certain rights to services and things like that. We're talking about IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The IDEA Act mandates that general education teachers, so just regular teachers in a regular setting, not a special ed teacher or anything like that, that they need to modify their teaching strategy so that they can accommodate the particular learning style of the ASD child. So the ASD child isn't going to learn like everybody else, and everybody learns differently anyway, but the learning differences for these children are heightened. So they need to be able to modify their teaching strategy so that these children can access the general education curriculum. In addition, IDEA mandates that the teachers are to be highly qualified so that they can implement these modifications. And those are some of the things that children have the right under the IDEA Act. They have the right to zero reject, an unbiased classification, a free appropriate education, a least restrictive environment, procedural due process, and the right for their parents to participate in these processes. So those are some of the things that the children are entitled to under IDEA. So there's some, in my research, I discovered that there's some areas of IDEA that have gone unregulated. For example, when we're talking about IDEA mandating that teachers are to be highly trained and able to effectively modify their teaching strategies, I found that only 15% of universities at the pre-service level, so when a teacher goes through their credential training program, only 15% of those programs actually provide training in an ASD. Of that 15% that do, the training usually focuses on legal requirements and eligibility, which is actually beyond the scope of a gen ed teacher, so they don't have anything to do with those things. In addition, I found that school districts actually do not require, and this is nationwide, they don't require their general education teachings, and nor do they very often offer any trainings to their general education staff. The 20% that did get access to trainings really only get half-day workshops, and they're kind of didactic, so there's no hands-on training. And they're usually about 3 hours in length. And less than 5% of the general education teachers that were implementing modifications were not implementing modifications that we call EBPs, which are evidence-based procedures. So it's not based on research. They're kind of just flying by the seat of their pants. So getting into parents and caretakers as advocates, some of the things that we talked about before about the idea deficits and these kinds of things, obviously a parent or a caretaker is going to be, their roles are going to be shaped into that of an educational advocate. And some of the things that shape these roles are listed here. One, the ASD diagnosis can actually alleviate the stigma of being a bad parent, or help these parents shed labels such as, or parent blame, or their children are just bad children. So when a parent actually receives an ASD diagnosis, now at that point they can actually, it sets a smoother pathway for educational advocacy. They can advocate more effectively now that they are able to medicalize their child's behavior. In addition, the role of advocate, educational advocate, it requires an extensive amount of capital, and it's very specific. So they're looking at things, skills that encompass like time management, knowledge, communication skills, and appropriate behavior management, and that one's actually pretty huge. And the reason why these things are required is because, and I have a quote here, the ASD diagnosis alone doesn't just automatically throw these kids into a world where they're just automatically given services and modifications and things. You actually have to advocate. You have to use that, and you have to make it happen for them. So the continuity of an autism diagnosis nor the continuity of services are automatic, but rather have to be vigilantly maintained and negotiated by the parents. So the parents are the ones that are going to make these things happen for these children. So this particular skill set is not necessarily one that is imbibed among all social classes. So there is a difference in capital between poor and working class families compared to middle and upper class families. They both have a different set of skills, a different set of human capital that they've had imbibed just culturally growing up. So there's differences. And the lack of this skill set can actually exacerbate advocacy. And for example, talking about low-income parents, a lot of low-income parents are employed in an environment where they don't have flexible work hours. So that can also affect their role as advocate. They don't have flexible employment, and you're constantly having to go to IEP meetings, or you're having to take your child to doctor's appointments, or consult with this professional or this professional, then that can be an issue. And in addition, there's some strict welfare requirements that can oftentimes force a parent to choose between advocacy and employment. So a lot of the times, welfare will require parents to work, to be out in the workforce, in the labor force. And if you don't, you can lose your welfare. So again, if you are constantly having to take time off of work, then you're sort of up between a rock and a hard place. So those are some of the things that can shape your role as an educational advocate. So given the uneven implementation of IDEA and the lack of information that parents can sometimes receive, the objective of my research was to understand the experiences from a parent's perspective of navigating and framing the education and identity of their ASD child within the structure of the public school system. Some of the research questions that I was looking at, that I was trying to explore is, how do schools organize services for ASD kids? And how do parents understand those resources and know how to access them? Also, how do the educational and social class backgrounds, so cultural capital, the human capital that we were talking about, how does that impact the interactions with the school? And then, in addition, how does that impact the outcomes for their children? And then lastly, how do the parents understand their child's identity, which is constantly changing within the framework of the ASD label? So looking at my methods, the sample size is actually quite small. I did 5 interviews, they were all in depth. I did 4 in-person interviews and 1 interview via Skype. Everybody gave me informed consent. All of my participants were recruited through gatekeepers, I did draft a research ad and had sent that out to all kinds of different organizations and places, but actually got a very poor response to the research ads. My interviews were, again, in depth, so they were lasting anywhere between an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. And they were very dense with information as well as emotion. And the interview guide, I was constantly changing. So every time I did an interview, I would immediately go and write notes down and that kind of thing, and it was constantly changing, and then I would come up with more stuff as I was transcribing. So that's kind of just always evolving. Talking about my sample, again, I had 5 families with children that already had an ASD diagnosis from some sort of institution. All of the children were placed in a general education setting. Again, so there were no special day class children or anything like that. They were either currently or previously. All 5 children had an IEP in place. 4 of the families were from neighboring Northern California counties, and the one family that I Skyped with was from Indiana. So that was interesting. And I have a descriptive sort of a demographic table. As you can see, all of the participants, all of the parents identified as Caucasian. And although the sample size was actually quite small, I found the educational backgrounds to be pretty diverse. They were ranging from some college education to a PhD, and some had multiple degrees and different types of certificates and things like that. The family incomes were ranging anywhere between $60,000 to $150,000. 2 of the parents were married, single, and 3 were married. So out of the preliminary findings, I came up with 3 themes. One was education and advocacy. The second was education and early awareness. And the third would be development of specialization. So as far as education and advocacy is concerned, I discovered a potential correlation between the the educational background and the advocacy of the parents. So basically what I found was that the advocacy practices were more efficient and effective in those families who had more education, and less efficient and effective in families with less education. Families with less education were more likely to sort of just accept recommendations and suggestions, I found, not just from the school, but from the child's medical team as well. So there wasn't any, in-depth questioning or further investigation from the parents. They were just accepting whatever was being fed to them. Families with less education weren't necessarily as aware of and were less likely to utilize local resources, places like diagnostic centers and assessment centers, where if their child was deemed eligible, they could receive no-cost services for their children. Things like speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, all those kinds of things, ABA. And then parents who had more education are more likely to accept their child's ASD diagnosis than those with less education. And I found that the acceptance, that the engaging in the diagnosis itself really had an impact on their ability to advocate. If they weren't as engaged with the diagnosis, or they were still in sort of a denial phase, then they weren't pushing forward as hard as they might have, as other parents were with advocating. So for example, making some comparisons, this is a woman, Jessica is a 30-year-old with some college education, and she has an ASD child who's CC. So this is a quote from her. There was a lot of resources that we had for kids with autism. But navigating that and trying to get ABA or trying to get a aid in the classroom with her was just a struggle. It was just insane. We couldn't end up getting it because they said, oh, we have someone who comes in that can kind of help her. And me, being naive, thought like, well, if that's the best you can do, that's fine. So you can see that there was an acceptance of, well, we can kind of, make some sort of modification. And there wasn't a lot of pushback from her. Compared to Mary and Bryce, Mary is 46 years old. She has dual master's degrees and multiple certificates. She manages a 60-hour work week and also teaches fitness classes on the weekends. And this is an example of a parent who has advanced advocacy skills. So Mary says, so I've actually done extensive training at their schools, teaching their teachers how to use writing programs, teaching them how to develop visual schedules, I volunteer in the classroom. I support the resource specialists. I mean, I've done extensive supporting and training to get them to have a better skill set. They did hire this supposed autism specialist who was supposed to come and help these children integrate throughout the district, but his skill set was so poor, he didn't even know how to make a visual schedule. So I had to create visual schedules and show him how to do it and explain to him how to tie the behavior to this schedule. And you know, I've done an extensive amount, much more than any other parent I've ever seen in terms of education. So you obviously at no point have had to get a lawyer or an advocate or anything like that. No, they don't mess with me. There's been several incidences that have occurred where they know that I could sue. So here you can see the difference between Jessica and her daughter Cece and Mary and her son Bryce. Given that, I want to just make something really clear that it's definitely not the contention of my research to imply a bad parent versus a good parent kind of a theme. I found that all the parents involved in the study were, they wished to advocate to the best of their ability for their children. Everybody wanted positive, successful outcomes for their kids. Everybody was engaged, caring, and loving. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to set up something that, you know, implies, well, this is a bad parent and this is a better parent kind of a thing. So moving on to the second theme, education and early awareness. I also found a potential correlation between the participants' level of education and when the participants first developed an awareness or a suspicion that there was a deficit or something kind of off with their kiddos. For example, Dr. Meff and her daughter Nora. Dr. Meff is 63 years old. She has dual master's degrees and also has a PhD. And in this quote, she is explaining her experience. She was concerned that there were neurological deficits when her daughter was 1 week old. And then the quote here explains how she went about navigating through the different agencies, and I think by 6 weeks old or something, she had a nurse confirm that there were some neurological issues. So that's an example, again, somebody with advanced education that had really early awareness and kind of jumped on it as far as resources were concerned. Again, using Jessica and Cece going back, again, Jessica's 30 years old with some college, and she's explaining, so come age 5, she went to kindergarten, and we noticed that in a big setting there was, I believe there was like 28 to 30 kids in the classroom. She would literally go from 0 to angry in just a few seconds and start throwing chalkboards or just screaming. Screaming was her big thing. Screaming and crying uncontrollably was her big thing. And at first, I'd never had a kid that, at all that was in the school system, so I thought maybe this was normal. I'm not sure, maybe this has to do with her other medical condition, so we went around in circles for a while. So as you can see, Cece's 5, still not identified as an ASD child, and her mom is wondering whether or not this behavior is normal. So the third theme that I discovered was what I call development of specialization. So with an ASD diagnosis, the diagnosis itself just by nature really focuses on the child's deficits and on what they can't do. They're considered neurologically atypical. What I found was that every single one of the participants, irrespective of education or income, nurtured their ASD child's specific individual strengths. So if a child could do something really well, there was a concerted effort on behalf of the parents to nurture that interest and to develop that. And what I found was interesting is comparing that to an idea, I believe, given to us by Annette Leroux, concerted cultivation, where children are involved in many different types of extracurricular activities outside of the home. Oftentimes you'll see kids doing sports and swimming and music and tutoring and all that kind of stuff, where these kids can't do those types of things, but what their parents do engage in is their specialty. And what I found interesting is, I actually pulled this off the Autism Speaks website, and it's stating here, autism is not a disability, it's a different ability. So these kids do have strengths, and the parents are focused, kind of zoning in on those. And this is an example using parent Corey and her son Dominic. his specialized interests were nurtured by allowing him to kind of forfeit his regular 3rd grade homework and reading, and instead his mom was allowing him to do activities at home, considered homework almost, like reading books that were focused on engineering and playing video games like Minecraft that would allow him to build these elaborate structures and things like that. So he was sort of obsessed with certain things, and she picked up on that and went ahead and had his IEP modified so that he would be allowed to do these things as homework. And then again, going back to Mary and Bryce, for Mary and her family, they became aware very early on that Bryce had a really unique aptitude for music. And so the result is she really, like I said, made a concerted effort to support this interest outside of school. And now, as a result, he can play the drums, the piano, the guitar, and the flute rather well, actually, quite well. And here she says that he has perfect pitch and he has perfect rhythm. So this is something that I'm finding all parents doing. So kind of just to reiterate, we talked about the idea of regulations and their deficits and how that can kind of contribute to shaping the role of advocacy for the parents and the caretakers. In addition, the role of advocacy, it requires a very particular skill set, a very particular type of human capital that you're not going to see in all kinds of the different social classes. Poor working class families may face additional advocacy challenges associated with their employers or perhaps their welfare requirements, so that's also going to shape their role. The presence of an ASD diagnosis can allow more effective advocacy because it allows the parents to sort of shed that stigmatizing label as bad parent or avoid the parent blame that we've been seeing. And again, the preliminary research had revealed 3 emerging themes: education and advocacy, education and awareness, and development of specialization. I say preliminary because the research is not done. I'm still continuing with interviews and going to continue with the research until the spring of 2015. So moving forward, where I hope to go from here is to, obviously I want to continue conducting the interviews. I'd like to get at least 15 more families to participate. I'd really like to diversify my sample a little bit more. I'd like to include some families from different ethnic backgrounds. Continue to interview families with different educational backgrounds to see if these themes are going to keep continuing or if I'm going to find some sort of a difference. Yeah, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions?
I'm wondering about the education issue and how that plays in with sort of an expertise, right? Because to be the advocate, you need to believe that you understand or that you have knowledge, right? And of course, education, formal education, is somewhat tied to people's ability to sort of deal with knowledge. And so it seems like there's something, you're onto something with the education and perhaps social class tied in with that as well. And it seems like the people with more education at least feel like that they have the information to move forward. And I'm wondering if some of this is like confidence rather than just information, just that the rich people have more educated people have more information. Maybe they have a lot more confidence. Maybe both sides have the same amount of information, but the rich people or educated people have more confidence to deal with it. And so is there a difference between information and confidence to deal with the information?
Yeah, you're really onto something because what I noticed is when I did my research, was doing some preliminary research, and I looked at Nanette LaRoe's work. She did Unequal Childhoods. Sure. And one of the things that she noticed was with the poor, the working class family, these are people that typically aren't going to have an extended education or high education, is that they sort of are passive, particularly with dealing with institutions. So you're right, there is a confidence piece there, is that they don't feel comfortable. I don't know if it's that they don't feel comfortable or it's just what they've been in, the values that have been embedded with them, in them, from the culture that they come from. And I think it's something that can change if you pursue a higher education. I definitely see that as something that can evolve. But what I found really interesting with that theme is that I had the parents that had, there were a couple of parents that had less education than the other, but the one with less education had a higher family income. So the educational piece, I think, is key here, and it's not necessarily about the money. Because Jessica and Cece, the one, she's 30 and she has some college education, well, her household income was $150,000. Dr. Meff holds a PhD with dual master's degrees and multiple certificates, and I think their family income was $100,000. So there was a big difference, and it was all about the educational piece. So, and thank you for bringing that up.
I also think, seemed to me that your sample is kind of more educated.
Right.
On that more educated side so far. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. And it seemed like the income was on that kind of higher side as well. It seemed like people you talked to so far were a little more educated, a little higher income than the average person.
Yeah, I believe I think it was only 2 of the people that I interviewed had sort of that median kind of income. Yeah, 2 of them were in between 60 to 99. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to know what the 60, I mean, if it's at the high end there, then they're definitely way over median income. And
Right.
your education, right, and we only have, what do we have, 38 or 40, 39, 40% of people in the U.S. have college degrees.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, thank you for
you've
pointing
got
that
more
out.
educated people here
Correct.
than the average population.
Yeah, and moving forward, that's definitely, like I said, I really want to diversify my sample, because these are preliminary, and I really want to know if what I'm finding is going to continue, or if it's, what's really emerging out of this
Yeah,
data.
there's I remember reading a really interesting article in American Sociological Review about the spread of autism and how they said it moved from community to community, and more like a spread of word of mouth through information, right? And it was, you mentioned that at the beginning, that some of this is through diagnosis and information. So they were arguing that it was largely moving through communities, through word of mouth, and that was a social class issue with the communities. And at the beginning, it was all the rich communities who would diagnose autism because, well, they had the money to go to the best doctors, and they were diagnosing everything. But then it became very well known, and then it would spread into the poorer communities. And it was a really interesting article about how autism spreads by word of mouth into different social class communities.
Right. And what's interesting, talking about articles, is that I believe that people, minorities and things like that, they're going to get diagnosed later. Like you mentioned, the people that had more money and that were living in more affluent areas were more likely to get diagnosed
Earlier.
Yes,
Yeah.
earlier. They had the resources and were just more aware of potential deficits. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, really neat stuff.
I thought it was interesting as well. My parents have my sister with special needs, and she has epilepsy and hydrocephalus, and it's affected her cognitively over the years. And my parents are not well educated. My father has less than a high school degree, and my mom has some college. But my dad got into a job where he made good money and had good medical coverage, and so there was this association with money and the medicalization of her symptoms and everything. So this just kind of internalizing or just accepting at face value whatever was passed down to them from the doctors and whatnot, rather than say, I don't remember, your person with the dual master's degrees going in and drawing up schedules and like this really proactive, involved, feeling like they had the confidence and the education to really step in and own that power and that to be a creator of knowledge, and collaborate with the education system.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting correlation that you found.
Anybody else? Thank you very much
Excellent.
for your
Thank you.
attention.